Um, I want to talk with everybody today about a topic that I've been using this theme of Native Lives Matter pretty much all academic year, because I feel like post 2020 and 2021, we've seen this debate between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. And I started to think about, Native people were very quietly on the sidelines saying, Native Lives Matter, but how do we talk about that and how do we inject that into more contemporary politics? So the topic of today is making Native Lives Matter in American medicine and science. I want to start out with this photograph because I believe it is really critical. It's a critical framing to this conversation. We as Native people walking proudly, how we look, how we are, embodied spiritual beings, physical beings, but passing by, and we pass by all the time, we're passing by our decapitation, our social, political, psychological, spiritual, medical decapitation. You have a Native person on a t-shirt with a Native person on the bag, a person who's not Native. I'm assuming, sometimes it could be a Native person wearing these mascots, but I'm assuming it's a non-Native person passing us in our full humanity, showcasing the fact that America is largely oftentimes made up of our dehumanity. So this conversation about medicine, as Dr. Pilson, all of our other speakers have shown us, is about taking the humanity of Native people and reflecting on it and shining a light on it and allowing it to remove the kind of cancer of indigenous dehumanization that defines the history of the United States and also contemporary realities in the United States. So to show you how the creator is all creative, I didn't know Holly was going to talk about trauma and car accidents. I mean, I know she's a trauma surgeon, but Nicole and I were talking about this today. I was like, Nicole, what about Lumbee car accidents and how high schoolers at home in the Lumbee community talk about it? And I saw this photograph from high school in the Lumbee community where teenagers were dressed in white faces, and I don't know what the white faces represent, but they were holding up the data that described their relationship as teenagers to car accidents. And what I noticed on the signs was that none of the signs indicated that these were Native students, or that car crash statistics actually are amplified or have a certain meaning in Native communities. Basically, what the statistics on their poster say is that as teenagers, we die, in one case, 8 teens die every day in DUI crashes. So it's very general, very much about all teenagers. But as you can see on this graph that I showed you, there's tons of statistics about motor vehicle deaths and accidents. Native death, accidents, but death in particular related to car crashes are well above any other ethnic and racial category in the United States. So my question becomes, not only why are Native people not represented in data, which in this case we are, but why is it that we as Native people aren't in a position to really reflect on ourselves and our communities and say, listen, we as Native people have to take care of ourselves, and we as Native people are vulnerable, and we as Native people must be protected and secured in certain ways. Now, many of us are asking for that, but I feel like there are moments where I look into our home community in the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, but there's examples of this across tribal communities where Native people aren't given permission to talk about who we are, our vulnerability, our political state, our political status in the United States. So with that being said, let me move on. In many ways, we're in a reckoning right now. In the United States, we've been talking a lot about race over the last couple of years, if not the last several decades. And I found it interesting that Native perspectives, looking at the world through Native experiences is critical now, because in conversations about race and the history of ethnic cleansing and genocide in the United States, oftentimes Native peoples are left out in very creative ways. We Native people were the merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence, right? In the Constitution, we weren't 3/5 of a person or of a man. We were 0/5. So in the Declaration of Independence, we were merciless Indian savages. In the Constitution, we are not even represented, and we were nothing. We're not even there. And I thought about this years ago during an episode of 60 Minutes in which producers discuss lynching. And I want to play this video, and I hope you can hear it. If not, I'll describe what he's saying.
But it happened across the country.
The lynchings?
Yes, they found more than 4,000, and no doubt there's far more than that.
All right. So in this episode is a reflection on the fact that 60 Minutes had shown a series, I think, of episodes where they were showing and telling the story of lynching of African Americans, Black Americans in the United States. And they showed this map of lynching. So if you can see, as the red spreads across the United States, it's from the deep South and it spreads out into the United States. Well, I was thinking to myself, wait a minute, that basically, that storytelling of lynching in that particular context shows lynching as being in the South and really about Black and white relationships. Whereas if you look at a map of Indian death, of military war against Native people, of genocide, there's many spots and areas of Indian genocide across the United States that aren't on the 60 Minutes map, right? And so my question becomes, in that moment, how do we combine the two stories? We have a history of, African American and white American folks, in different places of power and subjectivity. And that story is very much the center of civil rights discourse. But oftentimes in civil rights and human rights discourse in the United States, it's often seen and it's often stated that Native American, the war of Native people, or the war of the military against Native people, which pressed Native people out of the way, which took land, which murdered women, children, men, which eradicated communities, which eradicated languages, which eradicated community, ecosystems, that wasn't lynching, but that was just part of the history of the United States. And I think that's unfair. That's unfair for anybody who's a student of history and wants to know what the real story is. But it's also unfair to Native people who proactively, we collectively want our stories, our tragedies, right? But also our hope to be part of this larger narrative of how America is going into the future. So in 60 Minutes, and I have a script, so I'm reading from it. Their view of lynching was that it was a white-Black reality, white perpetrators, Black victims. Most scholars and journalists of race forget that Abraham Lincoln regularly deployed lynching parties who were employed by the military. Murder of American Indians is often counted as a necessary part of the American story, a war that we, the US nation, had to go through to be who we are today. But this becomes a really interesting question and conversation right now, because I saw a TikTok video recently that showed white and Black students and parents participating in viewing a ceremony at the center of a high school gym outside Indianapolis. And my first reaction was, what do you expect in a state that literally, Indiana, that literally celebrates Indian genocide in its name? And more recently, we had the case of the Indianettes, who were invited to Disneyland to march, dance, and sing a song that says "Scalp 'em, Indian, scalp 'em." So I'm going to play both videos. One is from the high school in Indiana, and the other one is at Disney.
In the middle of warm-ups and all. In the middle of warm-ups and all.
All right, we'll play the next one. All right, that's all that I can take of that. So America is a perpetual process of hijacking indigenous names, images, and materials and making us into costumes, as you can see in both of these videos. Genocide of indigenous peoples often turn into home and safety, into health and humanitarianism, into education, into disingenuous fake toys. My family took my niece to the American Girl doll store in Los Angeles several years ago, and we opened up the front door of the store and I noticed two astronaut dolls. One was Black and one was white, and I immediately, the big uncle that I am, right, I asked a sales associate, where are the American Indian astronauts at? She replied, "We don't have one dressed like an astronaut, but we do have her." She pointed behind her and to a doll in faux leather regalia and a horse. So the Indian doll had a horse. My niece told her mom that she wanted a doll, an Indian doll who could fly. A year later in 2020, we took the same niece to see Williamsburg, Virginia. When she happened upon the statue of Pocahontas, she stood and stared for about 5 minutes. I kid you not. She was mesmerized. And I asked her abruptly, "Gabby, what do you think about her, the statue?" She knew what I was talking about. And she paused and she said, "Uncle, she looks like she's hurting." In my niece's view, Pocahontas was something she watched through Disney films. However, in this place, with these colonial stories surrounding her, she was a bit withdrawn but mesmerized. She said, "Uncle David, that's not the same Pocahontas that we watch on TV." There was something that Gabby was trying to figure out, some type of racial, symbolic, and geographical prison that she was trying to make sense of. She saw that there was an illusory realm, both historical and new, that made her unable to participate in everyday American life. We might consider the use of motion picture as an illusory space of representation, especially as major media moguls attempt to retell the stories of racial conflict within the colonial United States. Several years ago, television advertisements were abuzz about or with stories about NASA's Hidden Figures movie. Movies and documentaries came from every direction, extolling the value of Black women, mathematicians, and engineers in the mid-20th century space program. However, I was, as you might suspect, a bit upset that none of the stories of non-whiteness in these stories mentioned the many American Indian women who designed and manufactured the space program in the mid-20th century, including Mary Ross, who was Cherokee, who co-authored the NASA Planetary Flight Book version 3. American Indians are in states of perpetual otherness, as news media and film studies find no compelling reason or do not act on compelling reasons to humanize American Indians in critical stages of American history. Scholars of Hollywood, such as sociologist Nancy Yoon, who wrote a book about Asians in Hollywood, position American Indians as people of color instead of examining how Hollywood was formed as the genocide of American Indians, a story that's told in Leanne Howe's 2013 Seeing Red. The BIPOC or multicultural or multiracial movement in the sociology of race propels stories of colonialism that make American Indians one of many casualties of colonialism and not the first or the primary. And I want you to see, this is an article that one of several, but not many, articles that came out about the Navajo weavers that basically, if I'm not mistaken, weave the microchips that went to the Apollo astronaut vehicles. But this story wasn't important enough to make it a movie and make it very theatrical. But I think it is much worse if we kind of get into the nitty gritty. Indian mascots are casually looked over across various sports leagues because of the fairly large presence of sports-related novellas that focus on bullying, abuse, and Black racial tension in in American sports. In 2018, 30 for 30 story of Indiana coach Bobby Knight, in his story in the 30 for 30 documentary, there was no connections made between domestic abuse within Indiana and the fact that the name of the school is Indiana. The fact that the higher education in the state takes place in a very purposeful announcement of genocide. And when I began to look at the journalist who narrated that story, where did he go to school? He went to a school with the Indian mascot, which was Florida State. And another 30 for 30 documentary about Dennis Rodman, whose photo is here, journalists focused heavily on the fact that Rodman was taken care of by a white Oklahoma woman who called him the N-word. But as the story is told, there's no critical conversation about the fact that Rodman played for a college whose mascot was the quote unquote Savages. You might also remember that in the recent ESPN documentary, The Last Dance, Coach Phil Jackson and Dennis Rodman bonded over fetish-driven stories of Indian culture that were used by Jackson to help ground or stabilize Rodman during the time that he played for the Bulls. And if you didn't hear, Kelvin Sampson, who's a Lumbee NCAA coach, he was described in an article that was widely circulated online as one of 5 Black coaches. Well, It's not that blackness is wrong or whiteness is wrong or any other ethnicity or race is wrong. It's that Native identity and Native community never gets propelled. He's actually American Indian. He's Lumbee Indian, and he was wrapped inside the story of Black coaches, and there was no identification given to him that was Native American or American Indian. What we are witnessing throughout these stories is not simply the caricaturization of Indian life, but the outright transformation of Indian life into a skin within which other forms of human suffering move. Americans are so invested in stories of Black-white hatred or attempts to address abuse more generally in American society, those stories become so well funded that they miss or excuse the conditions of American Indian abuse that are textiled onto everyday experiences and that provide the foundation for abuse throughout the United States. Now, some of you will appreciate this. The CDC actually goes to Atlanta Braves games to celebrate. Think about that for a second as I move forward. I believe that this sense of indigenousness as textile, which makes American Indian attempts to fully humanize or harm and the need for reparative justice into a ghostly entity, is affecting the ways that American Indians are moved into positions of authority in the United States at critical moments in world history. Recently, the story of President Biden's choice for the next Supreme Court justice was announced. And this gets into what Holly was talking about with the number of Native American faculty. His choice is Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I immediately wondered why we were not given an American Indian justice. I began to look at the demographics of the lower federal courts from which Supreme Court justices are chosen, and I noticed something quite disturbing. 10% of those lower court judges are Black, 7% are Latinx, 4% are Asian, and approximately 0.07% are American Indian. 0.07, and I believe it might be a little less. I think I'm being generous with that number. Why is it important for us to have American Indian Supreme Court justices in what Chief Justice Marshall back in 1823 called the courts of the conqueror? Well, my first response is that many of the Indian cases that are currently before the Supreme Court deal with the conditions of indigenous protection. This means that the Supreme Court will make decisions based on indigenous human experiences that they don't understand. At the same time, they profit from the destruction of indigenous landscapes, as indicated by the fact that Justice Alito acknowledged that he has several $100,000 worth of investments in ExxonMobil, who has profited from stealing land and resources from various American Indian communities. And I began to think critically about the quagmires of indigenous representation over the last couple of years after I discovered that the CDC uses Atlanta Braves games for social events. Groups of white, Black, Asian, Latinx health experts have offices whose offices are draped in tomahawks and miniature Indians and war paint are responsible for statements about health disparities and implementation of health policies in the United States. Over the last few months, because of the nature of my work at MIT, my eyes have turned towards the interrelationships between science, technology, and American Indian genocide. And I'm interested in how science and technology as education and corporate progress are crafted through the ritualization of genocide. Participants in my course, Indigenous History of MIT, have been listening to various oral histories and testimonies of military personnel who came through MIT to train for various wars, especially World War II. In a particular oral history, a nuclear scientist who worked in the Manhattan Project, which basically created the bombs that were used on Japan at the end of World War II, described how he was trained at MIT to make nuclear weapons, then subsequently boarded naval ships named after assassinated American Indian leaders that headed to the Marshall Islands and the Pacific. The most well-known story is the story of Bikini Atoll, where America's nuclear testing created so much radiation that the indigenous peoples of the island had to abandon it. The costumization of American Indian death isn't always so obvious. Over the last decade, Facebook, now called Meta, has been scrutinized for its unethical behavior around data collection. When I hear these stories, I'm amused because all the storytelling of Facebook very rarely tells you the story of why it's important that Facebook was founded at Harvard. Mark Zuckerberg not only studied at Harvard, he developed his vision of Facebook, which is to give people the power to share within a university community that stole American Indian bodies and shared American Indian bodies with non-American Indian academics within conditions of closed, oftentimes secret processes against NAGPRA law. Over the last few months, I've spent precious time studying the racial politics between Harvard and MIT. In a January 2021 Harvard Crimson article, journalists opened with these words: Harvard has formed a steering committee to catalog and develop policies around human remains housed in the school's museum, University President Lawrence Bacow announced. At that time, there was a sudden urgency to swiftly deal justice to these bodies and lives. When I met with faculty at Harvard this past fall, I said, why wasn't there urgency 10, 20, 50 years ago when American Indians were asking for their relatives back? And if you remember, well, you may not remember, Harvard president and former MIT faculty Larry Bacow wrote an apologetic letter to the Harvard community and to the nation saying, we must begin to confront the reality of a past in which academic curiosity and opportunity overwhelmed humanity. And he said these individuals represent a chapter in our history that we must confront. And then further on, he says, on the behalf of the university community, I apologize for Harvard's role in collection practices that place the academic enterprise above human decency. And then he said, the committee's initial focus will be archival research on the remains of the 15 individuals, which they determine, or they say are slave bodies, Black slave bodies that were enslaved at, or of individuals that were enslaved at Harvard. So the remains of the 15 individuals identified the Harvard Peabody. And he said, guided by their findings, the committee will consult within and beyond the Harvard community to consider options for the return of these remains. The work of the committee will be informed by our existing efforts to care for one of the largest collections of American Indian remains in the country. So these are important. These bodies that were found were important, 15 Black slave bodies. But he basically said our energy is going to be given to restoring and returning and properly burying these bodies. But basically, we're going to keep holding on to tens of thousands of American Indian bodies that are in our basement. We're not giving them back. And this was confusing. 15 Black bodies warranted an apology and the creation of new commitments of money and resources to ethical conversations at Harvard, but thousands of Native bodies did not. And to make this work, to properly deal with the presence of Black bodies, the university would use its conditions of saving and guarding Native bodies that Native people have asked for. What we missed in this moment, what Harvard didn't discuss, was the fact that its fame as an institution of healthcare innovation benefited greatly from these storehouses of our indigenous relatives. Indian land and Indian bodies are the seed capital for contemporary medicine. And I want to make that a point right here. When the American Association of University Professors recently censured University of Texas for challenging critical race theory, my immediate thought was, why haven't you censored universities for possessing American Indian bodies in their basements or in their museums, and censored them for sitting on American Indian land? Does stolen land and the hoarding of American Indian bodies affect the safety of faculty on university campuses? Yes, it does. I think it does. For universities and healthcare organizations, to lead educational and medical educational programs, this must include a purposeful conversation about why we American Indians did not exist in the first place. And that conversation changes everything. It helps repair the past and it makes the future so much better. All right. So in this moment, we must ask whose lives matter. And immediately thereafter, we must ask whose deaths fuel whose lives. In the March 2021 Teen Vogue published an article titled, "What is Necropolitics? The Political Calculation of Life and Death." This op-ed written by Namrata Verghese explains the framework of necropolitics. And basically, what she missed, what several authors missed, is that as COVID became a conversation, the evidence for COVID was based on this idea that Native people weren't even a category. And the evidence they used, though, or the evidence that they used actually showed, when the evidence was truthful, showed that Native people were affected and died from COVID more than any other racial and ethnic community. And that's what brought us to this conference and this conversation. When Harvard University's Chan School of Public Health had a conversation, I believe this is June of 2021, if I'm not mistaken, they had a conversation with all kinds of diverse peoples, all ethnic groups, genders, but they didn't include Native peoples. And when I think this is the dean of the Chan School, introduced the conversation, she said, as you can see here on the text, Latinos and African Americans were 3 times more likely than white Americans to be affected by COVID. No mention of American Indian people's relationship with COVID, which, as we know, Native people were affected more than any other group by COVID at that time, and I think still today. And I'm very quickly to wrap up, we have to be very careful in the realm of public health, but also in the realm of articulating politically and educationally, intellectually, rates of COVID and any other health reality. If you're using data that either overtly misses Native people or that just looks over the fact that Native people suffer oftentimes more in terms of cancer and all other diseases, more than other people, you can't look at that, ignore it, and then create articles or, both academic and journalistic articles that purposely say this such and such group that aren't Native people are suffering and don't identify the fact that Native people are suffering. Basically, in terms of intellectualism and journalism, ethnically cleansing the intellectual and the journalistic space of Native people. This is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. It was what the thing we talked about in North Carolina while the pipeline was still a thing, which I think technically it's been canceled, but we think that they're going to try to push it forward into being in the future. This pipeline was weaved through the Monaca Nation of Virginia, down through other tribal communities in northern North Carolina, down through the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, which is at the bottom of the photo. It was surgically weaved through American Indian communities. So I asked physicians in North Carolina, I say, I know they see the effects of increased natural gas pipelines. I know they see increases in chicken CAFOs, agriculture that is purposely poisoning their community. And I asked them, why can't you explain these increasing rates of asthma, of cancer to a larger audience? And they basically tell me that they don't feel like anybody wants to listen to them. They feel like these conversations about American Indian suffering and health aren't allowed to be in the proper discourse, the proper play, the official spaces of public health and medical education in the United States. So Indigenous remattering, in conclusion, is the beginning of compassion. We must remove American Indian mascots. As you can see here on the bottom, we have basically University of Illinois saying our fighting Illini matter. But in that moment, they don't realize that there's a bunch of psychologists and psychiatrists who've said Indian mascots dehumanize and push our youth and some older Native folks into conditions of suicide and other health elements. And this is an interesting picture from University of Illinois School of Medicine. They actually wear the emblem of Illini or University of Illinois on their sleeve while they're supposedly training to offer healthcare that is not harmful. I don't think you can be in states of dehumanizing Native people and take the Hippocratic Oath to do a good job, to treat people with compassion and with the best healthcare that you can provide. Anyway, that was a quick summary of my talk. I appreciate your time.